Welcome everyone to another NASCAR Heat Evolution video. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at springs. And springs are one of the most crucial parts to setting up a car because they directly determine how much pressure or weight that each corner of the car is going to experience as you're going around the track. So let's start with the basics of this. All right, as you can see, I'm using a pair of front springs that are both the same. They're both 500 pounds per inch. Okay, the rear springs, I've got a 300 pound in the left rear and a 500 pound in the right rear. Now remember from previous video where we were talking about ride heights and corners of the car that I referred to, if you want to help the car turn, then you want to put more pressure on the left front or right rear. Now, when you put pressure on more pressure on either of those two, left front or right rear, you're going to help the car turn. You're going to make the car looser, help it rotate, however you want to phrase that. If you want the car to be tighter or more stable, then you're going to want to put more pressure on the right front or left rear. Now, that directly relates to the springs you're going to use. So right now I have the same on both fronts and a 300 and a 500 in the rear. Now, you say, why didn't you use the same in the rear? Well, I could, but in general, I want to use the softest springs in the front that I can. That's going to help the car ride lower, particularly in the corners. And it's also going to help those front tires to get grip, because particularly the right front is one of the most overworked tires potentially on the car, simply because you go into the corner and you're trying to get the car to turn. Well, the right front has the job of, when you're turning left, all the weight of the car wants to go to the right. So that's one thing that's dumping a lot of weight on the right front spring. Plus, in general, you're probably running more front weight than rear weight. So that's also, whenever you turn, just statically, it's going to put more weight on the right front. And you're also asking that right front tire, because it's one of the steering tires, to steer the car. So there's a lot going on for the right front tire in general. So in general, you're going to want to take as much pressure off the right front as you can. Okay, now in the rear, you look at what's called the spring split, or the difference in the left rear and the right rear spring. Now, the bigger this difference, right now I have a 200 pound difference, 500 pounds minus 300 pounds, give us a 200 pound difference. In this particular game, that seems to be a pretty good balance for a 1.5 mile type track. The lower I put the left rear, the looser this car will get, or the more it will turn. Okay, the easier it will turn. Now you can see 200 is the lowest we can go. Or, so if you say, oh, well, I want to get more spring split, well, what you could do is start out with something like this. Because 600 is the most you can go in the right rear, 200 is the least you can go in the left rear. Let's start there and see what we get. Now, I'm going to use the B button twice, which brings up our tire status. And once again, I'm going to completely invade the AI space by immediately coming onto the track. And what you're going to notice if you use a large spring split is that the rear of the car gets very tail happy. The rear of the car wants to come around in a hurry. And so I am being very delicate with this car. And as you can see, it becomes very difficult to control. As a matter of fact, it's probably going to be very difficult for me to complete a lap under these conditions at any sort of a reasonable speed, because as I turn the wheel, and particularly when I get back to the throttle, it's very loose when I go into the corner, but it's at its worst when I get on the gas. And the reason is, when you get back on the gas, then that sends more pressure directly to the rear wheels, which of course have a large split. So you're sending a lot more weight to the right rear than you are the left rear. All right, so let's go back to what we had. Only, I tell you what, let's go ahead and make these the same. All right, so that means that for one thing, when we get back on the gas, we're going to be putting the same amount of weight, in theory, to the left rear as we do the right rear. Now, what you're going to notice is this car doesn't want to turn. Now, right now, it may be hard to tell in the video, but I'm having to really turn this wheel in order to get the car to turn. So we go into the corner, and the car doesn't want to turn, but as soon as I get back to the gas, it makes it worse. So I'm having to really work this car to get it through the corner. This car does not want to turn very much at all, and all I did was change the rear springs, nothing else. And the car, you can see it's shoving straight up the track. So that's not a good way to set up a car either. Now, as with everything else, on a race car, whenever you change one thing, it affects several other things. So you can't just change one thing and think that everything else is going to be perfect. So you have to find, in this case, a rear spring split for ovals that's going to work for you based on how you use the throttle. In this case, since you're basically wide open the entire way around the track, you want to give the car enough spring split to allow the car to turn in a constant radius through the corner without getting too loose or too tight. But because everything counts on everything else, this is also going to deal with some other settings, namely your track bar settings over here. So let's talk a little bit about your track bar. Track bar is located in the rear of the car, okay, near the rear springs, and it's going to control the overall rotation of the rear end of the car. It works in a similar fashion with the left rear and the right rear springs. So what you want to do is, if you have a car that you have a good, let's say you've already worked on your springs here. Okay, I've worked on my springs. I like a 200-pound split in the rear. That feels good to me for now. Again, you can always go back and work on these things. Let's say for now it feels pretty good, but the car still doesn't turn quite enough. Then you could come over and you could work with the track bar. Now, the left and right hand side of the track bar can be adjusted independent of one another. And in general, if you increase both of them, like right now I'm using 11 and 13, if you increase both sides, so let's say I went up to 12 and 14, increasing both of them proportionally will make the car looser throughout the entire corner. Okay, if you just, let's take it back down to 11 and 13 where we started. Let's say I just increased the left side. Maybe I went a large change, a full 2 inches up on the left rear, but nothing on the right side. Well, what that's going to do is it should help the car rotate through entry and through the center of the corner, but it will, because I haven't done anything on the right side, it should make the car a little tighter on exit. So what you can do, this is particularly effective at some short tracks, is you can end up seeing somebody run something like this. Now, this is a bit exaggerated over probably what you would see, but a higher left side track bar than right side track bar can help the car to cut or rotate through the center of the corner without getting it loose on exit. So that's something else that you can work on. That's something that could be particularly effective somewhere like Martinsville, for example. But in general, I'm using the same basic principle that I used with the springs. I want a little bit of split between the two. I want the right side higher than the left side by some amount so that it will help the car to rotate in the rear. Okay, so now let's go over briefly what we've looked at on the springs. So the springs, the fronts, I generally try to get as soft as possible, although I haven't quite determined that 500 pounds is as soft as I can get them. That's where I'm headed with it. Okay, in the rear of the car, remember, look at the car, think of the car diagonally. If I add if I add strength to the left front spring, then that's going to help the car to rotate. In this case, because with the left front, it's going to particularly help it rotate through the entry and probably through the center some as well. Okay, if I say, well, I need a little bit of help, but it's more on exit, okay, then you've got two options. Want to help the car on entry? You can either go up on the left front or down on the right front. If we're just dealing with springs and nothing else, you can do that. If you want to help the exit, if you want to help the car turn on exit, then you can either go down on the left spring or you can go up on the right rear spring. So those are your options, or of course you can do a combination of both. So let's see what happens if I leave the other springs alone and make a large change in the left rear. So I'm going to go all the way up to 1,000. So I'm going to double the strength of this particular spring. Now, in your head, you should have an idea of what this is going to do to the car even before you get out on the track. Oh, that didn't turn out well. Let's go back, try that again. So what's going to happen? What are you thinking is going to happen as soon as we get out on the track? Well, because I only changed the left front and I increased it quite a bit, going from 500 pounds to 1,000 pounds, then I would expect that this car is going to rotate quite a bit better. And yep, it sure is. You can see the car is rotating quite a bit more. Now you might say, is it always going to have this much of a difference? Well, it depends. If your car is like mine was and it was already dialed in pretty good for me, then making a huge change to it is going to make a huge result. In this case, it's making the car a lot looser for me. Let's see if we notice anything. Well, see, we're going to have a hard time noticing things because that was a big change for my car. So as you can see, it's rotating quite a bit more than I need it to. So we say, okay, I understand where we're coming from there. Let's look at what happens if I do that very same thing on the right front. How's that going to make the car behave differently? Well, let's take a look. And once again, I haven't learned my lesson, so I'm going to go right out onto the track. All right, what I would expect this to do, because I'm adding more pressure to the right front, more weight to the right front, I would expect this thing to have a harder time rotating. And that's exactly what I'm seeing. The car wants to push up toward the wall. The front end does not want to turn. You'll also notice that this changes the feel of your force feedback in the steering as well. And you can see I'm on the gas just like I normally would be, but this time I'm all the way up into the third groove by the wall. So let's go ahead and run a little bit longer. As you can see, this thing is really wanting to go up toward the wall. So if you're having this type of a condition in your car, if you're seeing that the car just does not want to turn on entry, then take a look at your left front and right front springs. It could be that you've got some things out of balance there, and simply decreasing or making the right front spring softer is the only adjustment you need. All right, so I'm still able to get a fairly decent time, but the car is really washing out in the corner and does not want to turn. If we look at that on our tire temperatures, you can see that the right front is running quite a bit hotter now. It looks like 7 to 8 degrees and probably going to get a little bit more than that as we run longer. through the corners. The right front is a good bit hotter. And overall, that's probably the best tool that you've got in trying to figure out what your car is doing other than the feel of it. I would say if the car feels looser to you, if the car is really feels like it's over rotating, then take a look at your tire temps. If you say, man, this thing feels like it is just over rotating, and you look at the tire temperatures and figure out that, yeah, the right rear is running a good bit hotter than the right front,
all clear,
then those two match up. The tire temperatures are telling you that the car isn't rotating as good as you would like, and the feel from the steering wheel is telling you that the car isn't rotating as well as you would like. So it's always nice whenever the feedback matches up between the steering wheel and the tires. Okay, so that takes care of the springs and gives you an idea of how I like to look at the springs and how I like to set up some basic settings. What you'll find is you'll want to come up with a base setup for certain types of tracks. For example, the 1.5 mile type tracks, you'll want to come up with a base setup so that because this game doesn't allow you to copy setups between tracks, that you'll have to write this down and then say, okay, when I come to a certain track, I want to use, 600 pound springs in the front or whatever the case may be, and then just start there and use it as a baseline. Same thing over with your track bar. You may find that on 1.5 mile type tracks, Atlanta, Texas, Chicago, Kansas, these types of places, Charlotte as well, that maybe you're using a very similar setup, which gives you a very similar feel. So that once you improve on one track, you can carry that over to multiple types of tracks. Again, one thing I would encourage you to do on short tracks in particular is play around with this track bar, particularly the idea of using higher left side settings than right side settings, because that can really help the car turn in the center of the corner and allow you at a place like Martinsville to really get hard and aggressive on the throttle coming off without the car getting loose and wanting to spin out. I hope you've been able to learn some things from this video. Again, feel free to leave any comments or suggestions in the comments section below the video. And stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat Evolution on Knee Pit Gaming.